welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I'm actually going to take a moment out, and I know this show is going to sound a little bit one-sided or gendered, but today's show, I'm going to be focusing on men. This show is kind of inspired to me today through some client interactions I've had recently, and some things I've been reading on social media about men and how they interact and their feelings, and even comments by others in this regard. Today, what I really want to talk about is the power of vulnerability inside of masculinity. Now, vulnerability is often seen as the antithesis of masculinity, a quality reserved for the weak or the feminine. Yet beneath the stoic facade lies a profound truth here. The ability to be vulnerable is not only courageous, but it's essential for authentic connection and emotional well-being. Now, as men, we're taught to suppress our emotions, to build up defenses and armor against vulnerability in the pursuit of strength and independence. But what if I was to tell you that vulnerability is the key here to truly unlocking our most authentic and truest self, to forging a deeper connection with our family, our friends, or our partner? And it's really essential for us to living a more fulfilling and better quality of life. Now, on today's show, I really want to kind of cover the power inside of vulnerability, especially within the context of masculinity. Now, and here, there's a real profound impact on mental health and the relationships that we don't tend to explore as men, especially when we're talking about masculinity in this regard. Now, I do have a personal short story I'm going to share today, and I have his permission. I've changed his name because he's on FET. He's semi-well known, but he came to me struggling a little bit within this context because his emotions or lack thereof became a hindrance for him in his relationship and in his professional life. It impacted him. So we've been working on that together for about the last 3.5 months. We've started to make some headway, and he started to see some positive changes in 2 aspects of his life. So I'm going to share a little bit of his story today. I want to look at a little bit of more of the psychology behind this and some reflections of how our lifestyle intertwines with men's emotions. And I really ultimately and finally I want to really kind of touch base on this, embracing the power of vulnerability as a path to liberation and our own growth, especially inside of men. And what we need to understand is men aren't often vulnerable. Are we becoming better equipped in understanding our own emotions? Absolutely. Are we becoming better equipped at understanding who we are and how those emotions interact and work with our partners and ourselves, our families and our friends? Absolutely. But oftentimes we're told that in different places in the world, we have to suppress them to get ahead. We can't share how we feel because it's going to make us look less than, and it does. It really does, like I mentioned before, it makes us come across as weak. So let's kind of dive right into this. First, let's understand vulnerability, right? Now, vulnerability here is often misunderstood as a sign of weakness. But in reality, it requires immense courage and strength to lower our defenses and expose our true selves to others. Now, if we look in the context of the BDSM community, where our power dynamics and trust play centric roles, vulnerability takes on a heightened significance, and it's not just merely the act of surrender, but a profound expression of trust and intimacy. Now, by relinquishing control and allowing ourselves to be seen in our most vulnerable state, we open ourselves up to a depth of connection and understanding that's unparalleled. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, often when I'm even working with couples, sometimes we find that we'll talk about limits. Even if we're meeting somebody new and we're in the beginning stages and we're negotiating, we're talking about all these different pursuits. But when we really connect with somebody, when we are really in sync with somebody, we trust somebody, we're vulnerable with somebody, sometimes rarely, not, I mean, it's not all the time, but sometimes we're willing to push beyond our limits because it becomes a place we want to go with that person that we're with because we trust them and we know they're not going to hurt us. Now, does this apply to every encounter? No, it doesn't. And that's fine. But what does happen here is we can allow ourselves, if we find that right person, when we're truly vulnerable with them, to go to heights and places that we never once experienced to before because they're the person we want to suck the marrow out of life from or with. Right? So it really becomes an interesting concept. I think back, times, people you thought that, you just could go. There wasn't something you weren't really to surrender. You were maybe hesitant, but because it was that person and you knew that you were safe and you could bare your entire soul, you could go there with them. This is even something I touched base on a couple of weeks ago when I was doing the first part of the interviews for parenting in BDSM. And in that conversation, it's a wonderful conversation. When I was interviewing the dominant, the reality is that he opened up about his experiences and his vulnerability with his partner. And now that he knows that his partner is willing to embrace them and help him explore and is supportive, we can go deeper. And that's what having a really solid partner in our corner is all about. And guys, let me talk to you here for a second. This is one of the truly important aspects of the lifestyle we don't talk about. Being vulnerable with somebody, opening up, reflecting on who we are, what we want, and how we want to explore it with them. If we can take the chance to listen and not be judgmental and understand and open up our eyes just a little bit and embrace what somebody's saying and really hear them, we take the chance here on really opening up to a new world. So let's get back to kind of understanding more here about vulnerability. Now, the journey towards embracing vulnerability isn't without its challenges. Now, society has rigid expectations of masculinity and how often it dictates to us that men have to be strong and stoic and self-reliant and leave little room for vulnerability or emotional expression, because if we do so, it interferes with the types of jobs we do. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be very beneficial if you see a firefighter driving down the street and he's sitting there crying full nonstop because they're going to a house that's on fire. Or if we see an angry ambulance driver, it's probably not going to be the best, or a depressed police officer, or, a doctor who is, battling with some anxiety, especially about getting ready to go into surgery. So we tell men to really suppress how they feel, to explore it later when it's comfortable, but in private and away from prying ears. So that doesn't really mean they have any support at all. So the suppression of vulnerability comes at a true cost, and it leads to a disconnection from ourselves and others, and it really does contribute to a myriad of mental health issues: anxiety, stress, depression, manic states, questionability, self-doubt, questions on self-worth. So how does the challenges of being vulnerable as a man sit? For men, the pressure to conform to our traditional gender norms can create a profound sense of internal conflict. On one hand here, we yearn for connection and intimacy, and on the other, we fear perceived consequences if we're vulnerable. We might be rejected, we might be ridiculed, we might be emasculated. Now, this touches base a little bit on a movement that's going on that a lot of people just seem to be chucking out the word, and I've discussed this before about incelibates. Now, the incelibate movement, I'm not going to spend more than a minute here on this. That actually started as a support group for men who are struggling to find dating. What it's evolved into is something quite different. There is a history of it. If you're very curious, I actually recommend you take a quick read. But the name calling and all the stuff, and that's not only by other men and by women, it's not very helpful. It's not conducive to making the environment better. And the people inside of that movement that have become quite hostile, they're completely in the wrong, and I understand that. But they're actually, if you look at that movement and the history of that movement, they're not the ones who, they're the radicalizers, and they've changed that movement. Nevertheless, this fear here often leads men to erect emotional barriers and to hide behind their masks of strength, maybe anger, and vulnerability, and even at the expense of their own well being. Now, when we look at the lifestyle here, where vulnerability is not only accepted but celebrated, men can be afforded a unique opportunity to explore and confront these fears in an environment they know they'll feel, hopefully, supportive. And if they feel supported, you know, maybe they're going to go ahead and start talking about how they feel, about what they want, about their desires. Maybe it's going to take them a year to open up. Maybe they're going to explain about some of their fears and traumas that they're facing. Now, does that mean it gets to be used as a weapon against somebody else? No, it doesn't. I've said this before. Mental health issues or mental health problems are not an excuse for problematic behavior. That really goes for anybody. But, if you're facing something rigid, you need to maybe find some help and talk to somebody about it, or do your best to try to open up to your partner. Because they're going to be the ones that are emotionally equipped to help you and more than likely want to. If not, you're probably in an unhealthy relationship and it's not something you want to be in anyway. Now, if we look at acts of submission and surrender, we discover here that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but it's a source of strength. It becomes this gateway to a deeper connection and intimacy and self-discovery. Now, we typically see this in the, and I'm going to go into the typical gendered stereotypes where a man is a dominant and a female is a submissive, and she does the submission, and we actually embrace this, and we see the strength. We don't look at a submissive woman and go, oh God, she's weak and she needs to be protected. We are actually, as dominants, admiring their strength of and through their vulnerability in their submission. And that's actually quite an interesting point. We're celebrating that fact. We're celebrating that they can be vulnerable with us. And that's not something that's easy to do, right? Because they're taking a chance, a repeated chance, because more than likely somebody's had a bad relationship, and if they're getting to know somebody else, they've got to shed that armor again and try to be vulnerable with somebody new. Now, for the most part, most men are supporting that behavior. They're holding that strength, they're embracing it, they're protecting those people, they're allowing that submissive to find their place and feel safe. Now, we cherish that as men. But what are we doing for ourselves? Now, if we look at the dominant role, how much vulnerability are we giving in this aspect? And that's another interesting point. Now, even if we reverse these roles and as a man, we're submitting to somebody, whether it's another male or we're submitting to a female, there is vulnerability in here. There is a way we can connect to a deeper part of ourselves, but breaking free from these shackles of these societal expectations does require a lot of courage and resilience and a willingness to challenge the status quo and redefine what it means to be a man. You're not less than because you want to be vulnerable. You become better than. Now, how does this impact our mental health? And that's a really valid point because I love to come around to some of these things and really discuss some of these things. So the consequences of suppressing the vulnerability extend beyond our interpersonal relationships here and profoundly impacting our mental health in a way that it even impacts our overall well-being. Now, whether these themes of power and control or vulnerability are central, the stakes are often higher and the consequences are more profound inside of dynamics. Now, the failure to embrace vulnerability, whether it's ours or somebody else, manifests in a myriad of ways. Anxiety, like I mentioned, depression, substance abuse, relationship dysfunction. Yet, we then tend not to want to turn around and figure out what's going on. Why are we having a series of relationships that end where our partner is leaving us? Well, if we've had 3 partners in a row tell us all the same thing, that we're not talking, we're not opening up, and we're just blaming them, and then they're leaving. Are they the common denominator of the problem? Three different people with three different personalities? Or is the common denominator ourselves? And that is a tough reality to face. It really is. So this path to healing begins with acknowledging and embracing our own vulnerabilities, with allowing ourselves to be seen and supported by others. It doesn't mean we're weak because we're opening up. We're taking a chance to let people start to see who we are. Now, when we lash out in like anger, or we make snarky comments, or we're putting other people down, we're doing this because, it's a great defense so we can keep people at an arm's length. But it doesn't allow too many people to get in, and sometimes it just turns people off. Now, as men, we have to recognize that it's not this thing that's going to somehow make us less than, but it becomes a fundamental aspect of our own humanity and a source of strength and resilience in the face of adversity. So here, I want you to kind of think about something. What would it look like to embrace vulnerability as a path to healing and transformation, both within ourselves and inside of our relationships with others? Most recently, I had an experience with a client where we talked about vulnerability inside of his relationship. He took this a step further, and he decided he got very vulnerable with his partner. His partner embraced it, and subsequently it's making their relationship stronger. And I've only been working with them for a short period of time, but the impact on him being vulnerable has made a profound difference, not only inside of his relationship, but for himself. After all of these years, after all these decades, he's finding out who he can truly be. Now, I want to talk about this case study a little bit, to give some details on somebody I'm working with. He has given me permission to kind of discuss this. So I want you to consider here the story of Shane. Shane's a successful businessman. He's in his mid-40s. He spent more than 2.5 decades of successfully building walls around his emotions because they haven't served him well in the business world. And he believes vulnerability, or he used to believe vulnerability to be a liability in both his personal and his professional life. Shane didn't really have long-lasting relationships. None of his relationships in his history were longer than 6 months. His average relationship time was about 6 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. He was raised in a family that believed that vulnerability was weakness, where he was ridiculed for showing anything. Mom, dad didn't really believe in being vulnerable, so there was no validation when he was felt upset. This has affected him all of his life. So Shane learned really early on here to bury his feelings deep within and to present a facade of strength and invulnerability to the world. Yet, beneath this surface, though, he struggled with a profound sense of his loneliness and his disconnection. He didn't really understand why he couldn't make these meaningful connections, and yet was also persecuting himself at the same time. And he also knew he was having problems experiencing any real intimacy inside of his relationships. I'm not talking just physical. I'm not talking sex. I'm talking connecting with somebody on a deeper level. Now, what changed after we started working together and some encouragement and for him to get out there and start exploring the world into a different world? There was a chance encounter at a dungeon that Shane was confronted with, and the cost of this encounter was his emotional armor. In the middle of a scene, his dominant partner gently encouraged him to let go of his defenses, to actually embrace his vulnerability, because this is something we had been talking about, that letting go, kind of being in the moment and exploring and experiencing his emotional range. Now, I knew it was there. And he'd been having this conversation with his current person he's been seeing. And I told him this is probably going to lead you to a big path of emotional liberation and self discovery. And when he came back, he talked in that moment of surrender. Shane experienced a profound sense of release. He could actually feel the shedding of the emotional layers of protection that had kept him imprisoned for so long. This became a real pivotal turning point in Shane's life and his journey towards a little bit more of an authentic self and understanding his wholeness as a person, that he wasn't just one dimensional. And Shane here at this moment realized that his true strength lied not in the suppression of his vulnerability, but by him embracing it. Now, it's not been an easy road for him. Shane's had to work at these notions because he's often been told that if you cry, if you hesitate, somebody else is going to take you out, or somebody else is going to get that position, or going to land that deal. You have to go for the kill. And while he's lived his life through this mantra and still does to this day, he also realizes all the things he's missing out on. An profound impact of a relative who was close to him, but he chose not to go to the funeral and go through the grieving process because he wanted to fly to another state to close the deal. And the impact that had on him. But he didn't tell anybody. But there are those silent whispers from others like, what are we actually sacrificing here to do these types of things? Subsequently, over these last few months, he's been working a lot harder and is coming to terms with things. He's still struggling. He's making better strides in his professional life, but still struggling in his personal life. Because when we start to unpack and understand that we're not validated as a child, we're told not only by our father, which is quite typical, not to show emotions as young men or boys growing up, but when we don't have our feelings validated by our own mother, it has a massive impact on our psychological well-being. Especially when we're told not to cry, or they don't hug us when we're upset, or when we're excited, there's no praise. These were things that weren't experienced for Shane for a very long time. So it shaped who he has become. And he could have gone a lot of different ways. But now he's starting to embrace this whole other side to himself. Now, let's break down a couple stereotypes here. It's easy to really fall into this trap of believing that masculinity does require us to be unyielding and steadfast. But the reality is far more nuanced here. And inside of our lifestyle, where we understand that there's power dynamics and things are in flux and control, that if we explore a little bit of vulnerability with this unparalleled depth and its complexity, we are then, as men, can be given permission to redefine masculinity on our own terms. We are allowed to then embrace vulnerability as this internal strength rather than weakness. We can turn it around and make it work for us, not against us, at least in the views that we have. And if we can radically reimagine what it means to be a man, one that challenges these traditional stereotypes and celebrates the full range of human experience, we can unlock another side to ourselves that most of us lock away. Now, I'm not saying this, there's anything wrong with becoming ultra feminized and being ultra in touch. But anything on any given spectrum that can be detrimental to our well-being is also not healthy. So we have to explore, we do everything in a balance. But we no longer work to suppress this actively. We don't have to be the man that's just, I'm the guy's guy and I'm going to drink the beer. Well, maybe it turns out you say, I don't really like beer and I don't like staying up until midnight. I like to, do plants and pots, and that's their way to relax, or do clay pottery. Who knows? But there's nothing less masculine about that than going to the racetrack and watching NASCAR. I don't watch sports. I don't have a favorite band, and I'm not a car guy. That doesn't make me any less of a man. But I know a lot about world politics. I worked in counterterrorism for a while. I understand what it's like to chase really bad people around the planet. I did a lot of other things in my life that, if we looked at them, and comparatively so, maybe I wouldn't have a man card. But that's okay. Being a man isn't defined by liking fast cars, listening to loud music, you know. It's not. It's not these things. I don't have to be a NASCAR super fan, and there's nothing wrong with NASCAR or football, or sports, or the type of car I want to drive. There's nothing wrong with those things, but they don't define manhood. Liking other things does, it rounds me out. I, I don't like opera, but I enjoy going to a museum and looking at art because I like enjoying culture. It makes me balanced. And there's nothing wrong if you like doing it. It balances you out, and it gives you the opportunity to explore the world that's around us. So how do we make and cultivate some more vulnerability? We just started talking about some of those things here. To really grow your vulnerability and to get more in touch with yourself, you have to be willing to confront your deepest fears and your insecurities. The rewards are immeasurable. Now, when we look at the community here, men are given a lot of tools and support they need to kind of get on this journey of self-discovery, to figure out where they lay in the spectrum of roles we have inside of the community. This gives you this immense power to explore the depths of your desire and your fears and your vulnerabilities in a safe environment. Now, if you want to try out and become a submissive, if you want to surrender or have an intimate connection, if you want to learn to dominate over another, we learn that vulnerability is not this sign of weakness, but really that source of empowerment. And that's why a lot of people talk about it. And it really is a gateway to deeper intimacy, connection, and self-awareness. It can build our self-confidence and self-worth. And if you're not going to do these things, how do you expect to be more in touch with who you are? How do you expect to be more authentic inside of not just your personal life and your professional world and your family connections, but even inside of our sphere? How do you expect to be more authentic? So what do we take away from all this? We learn that it's really essential here to recognize that vulnerability is not a destination, but it's a process. Or my favorite analogy is, this is not a sprint with a finish line, this is a marathon. It's a journey of self-discovery, growth, and it unfolds over our entire lifetime. And if we add in the mix, for those of us who are inside of the lifestyle, embracing vulnerability requires courage and resilience and this willingness to confront our deepest fears and insecurities. Yet in doing so, we open up ourselves to this world of possibility, a world where intimacy and connection and authenticity reign supreme. So take a moment and think about and reflect on your own relationship with invulnerability and how maybe you can make it stronger. How does it really truly manifest in your life, and what barriers do you encounter or think you're going to encounter if you try to embrace it? And most importantly here, what steps do you think you can do to cultivate a greater sense of vulnerability and authenticity inside of yourself or your relationships? I know this isn't the typical thing, This is some more introspective thinking. I know vulnerability here, it applies across the board. This discussion can go as very well for women as it can go for men, but to be honest with you, I think it's a lot harder for men to discuss and be vulnerable. I'm not saying that men aren't. I'm just saying that it's a little bit more difficult because I think we feel there's more eyes on us whether or not we're being vulnerable. And if we can begin to embrace the idea it's not a sign of weakness and a sign of strength, it makes us stronger. It becomes this catalyst for transformation and growth in our lives, inside the community, with our families, our friends, and most of all, that romantic connection that we're growing. And as men, we have the power to redefine masculinity on our own terms, to break free from the shackles of societal expectations and embrace vulnerability as a path to liberation and authenticity. So I'm going to leave you today with one final question, and I have some other things I want to add in. What would it look like for you to actually embrace vulnerability as a source of strength and resilience in your own life? I know that's something to consider. I know it's something new. Now, next week, I'm going to be launching and doing something new. I'm going to put up an event. It's kind of short notice, but it's going to be an event. I think it'll be on this upcoming weekend, this Sunday. I'm starting to work out the time still. I think I'll try to do Pacific time here, but we'll see. The event will go up. I'm going to be talking about the positive aspects of masculinity in men and redefining the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity. It'll be a free event for anybody who wants to come. I encourage anybody to come. I'll be doing this. It should be a 30-minute talk. All the details will go up, so don't quote me on everything, but everything will be coming up soon. I have been talking lately. I've got a lot of things going on. I'm waiting for the publishers on the book to kind of give me the final date. It should be here, I think, this week, maybe next week at latest. Hard book gets released and dropped. I'm working on all that. I do have a new podcast coming. I can't go into much more detail. I know I mentioned it once before, but that's coming out. And in next week's show, I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to give you a sneak peek. There are some things happening around the country I've been kind of alerted to recently, and I want to speak to this for a moment. We, inside of our community, when we have things that are like consent violations or past histories where we've passed judgment on people, whether we know the truth, we need to realize one thing. The BDSM community is not law enforcement. We're not. So if there's something arises, if we have an issue, we internally handle it. If it's a criminal offense, my hope is that it's taken care of by law enforcement, the courts, and if need be, the prison systems. But with that said, when a consent violation happens and we deem it, everybody's going to have their 2 cents about it. But what becomes the problem with this? The problem is that when we hang on to it and we don't let it go and we weaponize it, and we weaponize it for the bad, and we start holding on to these things for days, weeks, months, years later, decades later. There are a couple of problem places, hotspots right now. One is East Coast and West Coast can't be any more vague. One is in the southeastern part of the United States. I'll be speaking to that one probably by next week. Depending if I can kind of look into this other story, I'll tie it in together and I'll bring more details into that one. But that's kind of something up, and it's the impact that this is having on people and their lives. And that's what this show is about. I'm not an investigative reporter. I want to state that for the record. I'm not here to go, aha, gotcha. That's not what I do. I'm talking about the impact on our communities, the impact on people's lives, the emotional states, and their mental health. So that's coming up. But if this is the first time you're listening to me today on Spotify, please like, subscribe, yada, 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 follow along. Rate me 5 stars so other people can find me and I can keep the show going for free. This is year 3 now that I've been doing this. I'd really like to keep this up where it's at. So I really do need you people. If you're listening out there and you haven't rated me yet, I need you to download the Spotify app. Go to my page, go to where it says rate. Please rate me 5 stars so you can keep the show free and moving forward without any cost. But yeah, let me know what you think about the show today. I'm going to go ahead and I'll put up the question I asked here at the end. And let me know what you think about vulnerability in men and our struggles with it. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay cool.